In his well-loved allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan writes of the central character, Christian or pilgrim, entering a place called the Delectable Mountains. This is a little towards the end of his entire journey, but Bunyan has a number of images probably in mind there. But in that space, that area, Christian meets some shepherds. And the shepherds in the story, they take him to a high vista, overlooks a large area, and Christian and his companion, if they look very carefully, they're able to look off in the distance and they see their destination, the celestial city. And again, Bunyan probably has a lot of things that we could mine and pull out of the image there. Whenever I read that, I'm struck with this thought, and maybe this is more of a general idea, but it takes sometimes a high peak to really see what's important. It takes a high peak to see what's really important. And that is the case in our book that we've been looking at, Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. We've been working through this a little bit to a time. We're coming into chapter 3, and so I'd ask you to take your Bibles and turn with me to Ecclesiastes 3. It takes a high peak sometimes to see what's truly important, even as Christian experienced in that story. We've been looking at this book, and we've used an analogy, referenced an analogy kind of throughout the first two chapters of a stool with a couple of legs, and we're looking for that third leg. I'm going to switch analogies for a little bit this morning and carry a different picture along that I think is going to be helpful for us and really help us to think through the text and what's happening here. If we were to take the book of Ecclesiastes and map it topographically, so taking the passages and assigning elevation to each text, each portion of the book, the passage we're going to look at this morning, verses 1 through 15 of chapter 3, is easily one of the highest, if not the highest peak in the book. And there's a reason I'm saying that. Maybe that seems a little bit over the top, but it does seem to be quite a high point in this book. If I can stretch the analogy a little further and go back to the beginning of the book for a moment in our minds, if we think elevation-wise, the opening verses of this book would be something of the lowest point in the entire work. But that opening statement of vanities, all is vanity, we talked about the fact those words shock us. They're intended to punch and hard. In fact, we said they punch so hard, they shock us so much. Solomon goes on to actually argue for, no, actually what I'm saying is actually the case. I know it's hard to think, but it is true. And so starting off, very low altitude, very low elevation, throughout the first two chapters, to keep this analogy for a moment, and we're going somewhere with this, we've climbed a number of false peaks with Solomon. If you've done any hiking, you know what a false peak is. It's that time where you're hiking, maybe you've done Monadnock or somewhere else, and you're taking a trail and you're getting close to the top, and you're so excited because it's almost there. And then you break out of the trees or you get to that top and you realize, nope, just kidding, there's actually further to go. It was a false peak. And what's happened throughout the first two chapters is Solomon has, in essence, taken us up a number of false peaks. So we've trekked up the slopes of knowledge only to find it to be a knoll, not the heights we were looking for. We hiked to the pinnacle of pleasure with Solomon, and let's be honest, pleasure has its height, but it's not the height that will satisfy us. There's something higher. We walked a path of wisdom or skill, winding its way upward and thinking this will surely take us to the top, to the height. And it does take us high, but only again to a knob from which we see an even higher peak. And then lastly, we traverse the craggy cliffs of our labors, all the toil that we engage in for pleasure or provision, and it has its share of delightful views, but it is not the height we're seeking. It only rises so far. But with each of these false peaks, we've caught a glimpse of the real peak, and tried to do this as we go through at the end of these messages, typically trying to come back to the fact of, now, there is something in this, but there's something more. And so we've tried to get a little glimpse. There's something higher ahead. And now in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 15, we ascend the real peak. Or to draw on our initial metaphor, the two-legged stool, this passage finally gives us the third leg we've been looking for. This morning, what I'd like to do with this passage is lead us through it in a series of 4 looks. We're going to look around, first of all, and then we're going to look back in verse 9, and then verses 10 and 11 are in essence going to be the very top of the peak, and we're going to look up. And then the last few verses, 12 through 15, we're going to look in. And this structure is not necessarily something that you find in the text as far as wording or whatever, but I think as we go along, you're going to see this is exactly the sense of what we get here. If we keep this imagery in mind, it walks us through, and I don't think it's a mistake that we walk through in this progression, looking around, looking back, looking up, and then looking in. And we'll explain that as we go along. So if it's helpful, perhaps picture yourself having just hiked 4 promising peaks that each proved faults. You're in a valley to start with, thought each of these would take you up and out, but now you're standing at the same elevation as when you started. You're tired, you're out of breath, your legs are aching, and in desperate need of getting your bearings before scaling the looming heights ahead. So let's start by looking around. Let's not climb yet. Let's just look around. And let's survey what we've seen so far. I want to ask you this: what do you see? Solomon has so written these first 2 chapters that we as his readers should be standing in some level of shock at this point. If you're not finishing chapter 2 and feeling just a little bit depressed and maybe even a little bit surprised, you need to go back and read them again. You need to take your time and you need to walk back up each of those hills again and get to the top all out of breath and realize it's for nothing, and then go back down to the bottom again. And then go back up the second hill. And then go back up the third hill, and go back up the fourth hill, and then get to the end of chapter 2 and think, what in the world? We should be in shock. We've just witnessed a man with greater ability than any of us will ever possess ransack this earthly existence for something that makes it all make sense. Something that gives it ultimate, undying, unfading purpose. And I don't know about you, but this week my mouth has really, at times in my study, just hung open, almost just aghast at what we've explored and seen and what this man gave his life to and sought meaning in. And all of it just lies littered all over the place. You see it littered with crushed hopes, broken dreams, and fading treasures. It's like walking into a room where a child has pulled out every toy. Toys lie strewn across the floor and cover the bed. The closet's contents have vomited out of the closet in piles. Discarded clothes hang from doorknobs and dresser drawers. And in the middle of the room stands your child, and in tears they tell you, "I have nothing to do." And here we stand. We've pulled all the toys out of life. We've pulled all the clothes out of the drawers. And we literally stand here as children at the end of chapter 2 going, what's the point? As we look around for a moment, we're tempted to do what so many have done before at this moment and dispose of all those earthly realities. Here's the thing. In these moments, what often happens is human beings look at all the things that they've poured their life into and they go, well, that doesn't give any meaning. That doesn't do anything that I was looking for. So what do? I throw it away. After all, we reason, they are at best unhelpful and at worst wicked. The problem certainly lies, we think, in the strewn stuff we pursued and played with and found to be so pitiful. So, away with pursuits of knowledge. Such pursuits are unhelpful, we conclude. Away with pleasure and embrace a stoic life. Best to avoid such wicked delights, we conclude. Away with skill and wisdom for life. Free-spirited, free-ranging, free-thinking is obviously best. And away with work. Why ruin what strength you have in agony and ache? Unless you think that's simply an overblown response, it is not. You can go back through and find examples in history of individuals coming up against the vanity of certain things in life and just chucking it away. The church is littered with this. A really good example of this would be looking back and watching what the church, what believers in the past did with things like marriage. Well, that's certainly a passionate thing that is full of physical, and boy, we can't stand that, and that just seems like a bad thing, so let's just chuck it away. That's, if you have to have kids, okay. Necessary evil, I guess. We look around at the world and we see all the things we've played with and found to be so lacking, and we're tempted to toss it. We might even wonder, when is any of this ever appropriate? All right, we've looked around. Now listen, verse 1. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. In other words, what Solomon's doing here is he's going, whoa, slow up. I get it. You're looking around at all of these things of life and you're tempted to go to the other extreme. We just spent this extreme, pursue it all. We found it to be lacking. So maybe the meaning in life is to actually throw it all away. Deny yourself any of those things. Go through life like a stoic. Maybe that's the answer. And Solomon comes back with this opening statement. Wait a minute. For everything, there is a season. And there's a time for every event under heaven. All the false peaks we climbed with Solomon are still peaks. The presence of the real peak does not remove the reality of smaller peaks. But we're so quick to conclude that if something doesn't give ultimate satisfaction, it must give no satisfaction. And Solomon forces us to look around at the appropriate spectrums of life. Just listen. There's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to bear and a time to sow. Or tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. And these 8 verses are poetry that expand and grow as you read it. So if I can walk us very quickly through what's going on here, opening up in verse 1, there's this statement, for everything there is a season. And we should really ask the question, really? Everything? And then a clarification. Well, everything being every earthly event, it all has an appropriate appointed time. Well, what exactly do you have in mind, Solomon? And then what he does is he goes into details of life that resonate with our hearts and our minds. We get this. We read these and we go, yeah, okay, some of them are a little more challenging perhaps than others, but overall we read them and we go, yeah, you got a point. A time to be born, a time to die. Yeah, that's about right. It's like the sharpening of a telescope and focus, getting closer and more accurate, more detailed. These 14 couplets in verses 2 through 8 provide spectrums. Let's be clear, they're not prescriptive for every life. What Solomon's not saying here is, now everyone's going to experience all these things, the full range, every spectrum, all that's on the spectrum, it's all going to be part of everyone's life. That's not the point. And what's not the point is either that Solomon's commending all this. These are not meant to be, now, these are all things that should and must happen because they're all good and great things. What Solomon's doing here is he's acknowledging this is reality. You can't just throw all these events and experiences away and just act like, well, I'm just not going to do any of it. Because actually, this is what life is made up of. It's full of these kinds of events. This and that, that and this. The whole spectrum. It's all been appointed, and there's an appropriateness in life for these things. There is a time for every event under heaven. That's how this life works. And what Solomon's words here do is they pull us back from what could be a very depressing and dangerous cliff edge. It takes all of these things of life out of this chance bucket that I go through life and I just kind of pick and choose and kind of pull whatever I like out of it and just kind of like I'm skipping through an orchard. That's not it. These things are actually planned and timed and appropriate. There's an appointment. We needn't discard all the pursuits and pastimes of this life. Just because they don't resolve this futile existence doesn't mean they can't remain in this futile existence. Solomon gives the exact opposite. These things are appropriately a part of our lives. So look around. Let's get our bearings this morning. The answer to this futile life is not found in the delight nor the disposal of this earth's activities. That's verses 1 through 8. Look around. Before we move forward, if you're tempted to see it all and think just toss it out the window, don't go there. This is what this life is made of. But let's look back, because verse 9 raises a question that perhaps, as you've read this before, you've thought that seems a bit of an odd thing to all of a sudden raise in this whole sequence of writing. There's a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. Then this question, what gain has the worker from his toil? Well, look back. What's happening here, if we didn't notice this is a question that Solomon actually asked way back in chapter 1 and verse 3. It's the question he started with. So if you would, look back at chapter 1. Let's look at verse 3. He says in verse 2, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then verse 3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? What's the gain? That's the leading question. What do I get? And he seems to answer it in chapter 2, verse 11, when he comes to the end of this pleasure pursuit, and he says in verse 11, I considered all that my hands had done, the toil I'd expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and then this, there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So, what's to be gained? Well, you know what? I threw my life into whatever I could, and there's nothing. Well, that's really depressing. And then we wrapped up last week with this statement, verse 18 in chapter 2, when he says this, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun. Now as we look around and accept the reality that all the broken pursuits of this life are not the problem, they're simply appropriately timed features of this futile life, the specter of the original question rises up and goes, I'm still here. You haven't answered the question. What's the gain in all our toil? So we look back, we realize the question still stands. We still lack the third leg to give stability to this two-legged stool called this futile life. What's the answer, if there is one? Well, there is an answer, but it requires us to look in a different direction. And here's the thing, before we move to the next point, all of Solomon's pursuits so far have been on the horizontal plane. Recognize this, right? It's all on the horizontal. He sought answers in all these things on this plane of life, right? He's pursued the same pointless paths that previous people walked. Adam and Eve ate from the tree, horizontal plane. Aaron made Israel a calf out of gold, horizontal plane. David stole another man's wife, horizontal plane. Ahab murdered to steal a man's garden, horizontal plane. Jesus himself was offered the kingdoms of this earth, horizontal plane. And even this man, Demas, left Paul because of love for this world, horizontal plane, pursuing all these things in this existence, thinking somehow this will bring satisfaction. Well, if you can't find it in that, then you've got to look somewhere else. It's the habit of the human heart to seek satisfaction on the horizontal plane of life. So, let's turn our gaze up. Look up. Read with me verses 10 and 11 and notice how the focus turns upward. I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We're at the peak, friends. Maybe it doesn't feel like it, but we're at the top. We've now got the right look. Now we're looking up. We've hinted at it all along, but now it's stated clearly. Everything Solomon has seen and experienced, he ties back to God, and he does so in two ways. Twice in these two verses, Solomon speaks of God giving. He says, God has given, and then this phrase, He has put. It's the same word. So God has given, He has given. So two things He's given. Let's look at these. First of all, God gives man the tasks that keep him occupied. Do you believe this? God gives man the tasks that keep him occupied. We live in a world that very often we tend to live as practical deists. The idea that God kind of got things going, He got my life, He gave me life, yeah, and my life is from Him, and great, and He's out there somewhere, but He kind of got the whole thing going, and I kind of just bounce through life, and I kind of just fill my bag with whatever I feel like and pick and choose and kind of get to enjoy life. It's practical deism. Acknowledgement of God, but He's not really in charge of everything, and He's not actually doing much today. I just kind of, by chance, pick things up. It's the kind of expression that I just heard this week in an interview with an actor. If you're familiar with the actor by the name of Tom Selleck, he was interviewing about his career, 40-year career in acting, and he made this statement. It's really the story of an accidental career. I'd never taken an acting class. I had no training, no desire. I just wanted to get a job and work. Folks, we often live life like that. Just kind of an accidental thing. I kind of fell into that. Well, why did you do the job you did? Well, just because it sounded good, so I did it. Well, why do you have the family you have? Well, because, fell in love and we got married and we had kids. There we go. Practical deism. Just kind of accidentally, my bucket's full. Yay. I had a pretty good life. I had a really good, lucky life. It was great. How often do we think or even talk about our lives this way? What we've done, the careers we have, the families we raise are just tasks that have fallen to us. They're happy accidents. That's not true, though, according to Solomon. He says here, it's God who gives man the tasks that keep him occupied. And other scriptures support this conclusion. I'm going to give you two. You don't need to turn here, but if you'd like to, you can. But the first one I would give you is in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, God makes man and woman, male and female. And in verse 28, we're told this, that He blessed them, and here's the content of His blessing. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. Opening pages, opening words to the two first human beings, the first creation of God, and He gives them tasks to be occupied with. Multiply, fill the earth, rule it, subdue. This is all a blessing from God. And then chapter 2, we read a more detailed account of God's creation of Adam as well as His creation of the Garden of Eden, and we're told this in verse 15, the Lord God took the man, placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it. So here we have two instances before sin ever entered the world, and here's God giving man tasks to be occupied with, things to stay busy with. And then Genesis 3, of course, comes along, and Adam and Eve disobey God, and the tasks remain, but with a cursed twist. God still gave man work to be busy with, but now the work is hard and it's frustrating. Folks, let's keep our minds straight here. Let's stay focused here, because we often like to give God the blame for frustrating lives, frustrating work. The fact of the matter is, it's not his fault. He gave perfect tasks to perfect people in a perfect place that he made perfect. And we, in Adam, we saw fit to go ahead and disobey God and take it all and spoil it. To the extent that Romans can say this: just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, in this way death spread to all people. By the one man's disobedience, the many, us, were made sinners. The fact is, God remains graciously unchanged, and so Solomon can go on to state this truth about all that God will assign to his creation. He's made everything beautiful in its time. Or that word there might be a better way: he's made everything appropriate in its time. God assigns the tasks man is to be occupied with, but secondly, God gives the eternity that keeps man unsatisfied. This is an interesting statement. Solomon writes, God has also put eternity in their hearts, but no one can discover the work God has done from beginning to end. If the first gift of God highlights his giving the events, those things that make up our lives, this is highlighting God's giving the expanse that surrounds our lives and fills our lives. And the reality is, we can't fill it. We can't figure it all out. This really is quite a statement. First, Solomon states that God has given mankind eternity in their hearts. Another translation says it this way: he's put a sense of past and future into their minds. Men and women have a built-in sense of more. Just listen, just watch our world. We have it even in simple jingles and animated films like Beauty and the Beast, when Belle sings, "There must be more than this provincial life." Or we have it in billion-dollar organizations like NASA that we build to probe the more of space. There's more out there. We work an extra shift or take an extra job in hopes that more will solve some things. More. We live with this sense of there's something beyond. There's something more. This built-in sense of eternity is what drove Solomon on his stunning search. But then the second part here, God gives this sense of eternity or more, but he gives an inability to figure it all out or fill it all up. I was trying to think of a good illustration of this week and how to really bring this into, get a sense of this, what God's done here. And the best thing I could come up with, I don't know if this will help some, maybe it will, maybe not, but back in March, many of you are aware, I went to a pastor's conference down in D.C. As part of that, we had a couple of hours free, and so we went down to what's called the Capitol Mall. If you're not familiar with this space, it doesn't look that big when you're looking at it on a map or when you're looking at it from a distance. But you get there, and the three of us got out of our car, and we went, wow, this is a big space. From end to end, it's over a mile long, right? And in the whole space, the trail that goes around the mall space area, takes about an hour and a half total if you just average walking the whole thing. Scattered throughout the mall are over 100 monuments and memorials, and then sitting around the perimeter are 11 different Smithsonian museums, as well as other museums scattered just off of the mall area. It's a massive space, and there's other buildings where you can walk in, and there's galleries and floors and displays, and you can spend hours and days in this space, this little over 1 mile long space. And we had a couple hours. So we literally walked into and out of about 3 museums. Walked in, looked at a display, walked out, walked in, walked out, walked in, walked out. We walked down to one monument. Of all 100, we walked to one monument. We walked about half of that whole trail, and we finished up. We got back in the car, we went back, and we were like, there's so much more. Folks, that's as close as I can get in my mind what God's done here. He's given us eternity and immensity. And we live our lives, and every moment we go, but there's so much more. But there's so much more. And God has given us this inability to fill it all up. In such a far greater sense This is what God has done. He's given us an immense space in which to live eternity, and yet we have no ability to fully fill it or fully figure it all out. God gives man the tasks that keep him occupied and the eternity that keeps him unsatisfied. So let's take that now. Let's pull a thread that I think is going to hopefully pull this look-up point all together. All right, pull a thread here. What was the question Solomon started with and he came back to in verse 9? Wasn't it this? What's the gain in all the toil? He's found the answer. Ironically, the gain in all the toil is that it points us back to the giver of all the toil. I would actually say this. The question he finds is wrong. It's not what's the gain in all the toil, but who's the giver of all the toil. We crudely go through life walking through this earth going, what's in it for me? In reality, what we realize when we get to this peak, it's not about that. It's about who gave it to me. Are we following with this? We get to the point where we have this burning question, what's the gain in it all? What's the point? And we get to the top and it goes, look up! All of your work, all of that eternal expanse in your heart that you can't fill, it's all meant to point you to Him. It's not about what you get. It's about who gave it. And the wind and everything screams in your ear on this peak. It's not about you. Look up. Solomon, he sees the point. The toil that occupies our lives was given by someone, God Himself. The eternity that leaves us unsatisfied is only satisfied by the eternal one, God Himself. We've been so preoccupied looking for the gain, we've missed the giver. Folks, God has given all the tasks that occupy, I'll just take this number, your 70 years of life. And He's made it all appropriate in its time. But He's also set your 70 years in a coastless ocean called eternity. And you will never, ever explore its full breadth and depth. So if you go through life trying to fill an eternal existence with temporal events, you will be frustrated. Young people, if I can really talk to you for a moment, because you're on the beginning edge of life and you're looking at everything as though it's this massive place, this world that I'm told, go out and grab whatever you want because it all lies before you. That's the wrong view. If you go through life looking for just grab it all and fill up this eternal existence, you will end up frustrated because it's not about what you get. Live life in pursuit of what you can get apart from the one who's given it, and you will ultimately say with Solomon, vanity of vanities, it's all vanity. But looking up now enables us to look within. This is the order. This is so, I don't think this is a mistake. Let me pause. When we stop and look around, and we take stock of everything around, and then we look back and we go, oh, there's still questions in our lives. Where do we often go for answers? Inside. We look in. Interesting, isn't it? Solomon doesn't go there first. He's already done that for a little bit. He goes, look up. Let's look at God. All right, now that we've got a good vision of God, now that we've seen what He gives and what He does, now it's time to look in and see what this does in our hearts. So let's look within. Verses 12 through 15, let me read these verses. I perceived that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before Him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. Let me start off just by taking these verses. Twice, Solomon says, I perceived. Verse 12 and verse 14. That's that word I said last week, is this intimate knowledge. Like, I've looked into this really close, and I now have understanding about a couple things. All right? So he says this twice. So two things that he's going to conclude. looking into our own hearts and our lives, and they both match up with those two things we saw that God gives. So let me give them to you this way. First, because God gives man the events that keep him occupied, man should enjoy what God gives. Solomon says the best thing any man or woman can do with the tasks that God has given is to enjoy them and do good with them as long as they live. You've been given something. You've been given life. You've been given opportunities. You've been given tasks. So enjoy. And I think to some of our ears, that almost sounds a little bit wrong. Even what he says here might hit us and be like, it sounds like he's pushing hedonism here. Go drink and be merry. But keep it in context, folks. We've been on the top. We've looked up and seen this is our God, and he's given these things. What do you expect people do with things you give them? Enjoy it. This is not wrong. Enjoy life. What does this look like? Let me give you a few things, okay? Just a few quick things. What does this look like for the tasks we find ourselves busy with? It looks like a mother reminding herself as she wipes faucets of snot and sweeps countless crumbs that God has been kind. God has been kind to give you little souls that you can nurture and cherish for him. Don't miss this. Mothers, I know the days can be long and it can seem unwearying. But don't forget, these are little lives God gave you. So stop and take a hug. So enjoy a game with your child. It looks like a teacher staring at papers to grade and students to assess and seeing not merely projects to finish, but people God has set in one's life to inform and instruct in his ways and his thinking. How amazing is that? That you have a job that God has given to you to do that intersects with the forming up of a human heart and life and mind, potentially in a relationship with God. It looks like the husband waking early on a Saturday to a list of tasks his wife has compiled and going to the task with gratitude that God has granted him strength and skill to love his wife in very specific, tangible ways this day. It looks like the employee praying about his or her less than exciting work, asking God to provide either another option that would be more enjoyable or contentment and diligence to do the work that God has given, and all the time thanking God for the provision he gives either way. It looks like taking time in the midst of projects, deadlines, schedules, lists, reading, writing, gardening, hiking, parenting, discipling, and all the other tasks of life to worship the God who gives us all things richly to enjoy. It looks like playing games with your children, laughing at corny jokes around the dinner table, hiking with friends, sipping a perfectly brewed cup of hot tea or coffee, learning about a topic you've always been interested in, picking up a hobby. It looks like enjoying the life God has given you. Enjoy life. It's God's gift. But second, because God gives man the eternity that keeps him unsatisfied, fear God. Solomon says he's perceived that everything God does will last forever. He works so that people will be in awe of him. And there's this last little phrase of this passage in verse 15 that maybe, again, is like one of those, why would you say that, Solomon? Where he says, God is the judge seeking justice for the persecuted. This is Solomon's, if I can put it this way, this is Solomon's way of reminding us, hey, don't forget, God ultimately holds the human life accountable. Maybe think of it this way. Watch people enter into full-on, headlong hedonism, pursuit of pleasure. Just enjoy life. It's all number one. It's all the first thing. Just enjoy life. What often happens? You often tend to hurt others in the process. We just saw this morning with David and his fall with Bathsheba. I'm going to enjoy life. I'm going to enjoy what I want. And we watched the hurt spiral out. And God says, I want you to remember, even as you enjoy life, don't forget, I am the one who brings justice for the persecuted. Fear God. So what does this look like? It looks like holding a hobby carefully lest it become our God. It looks like knowing when to put down the book and pay a visit to a fellow believer who could use some encouragement. It looks like discerning the line between saving what funds God provides and sharing the funds God provides. It looks like learning to laugh at corny jokes but not at crude jokes. It looks like identifying God's priorities, obeying God's commands, and reflecting Christ's character, even if that means the loss of some quote-unquote fun. Fear God. And held together, these two conclusions guide and guard us as we live life under the sun. And I would contend this, that each of us tends to live life in such a way that we probably are going to need one of these more than the other in much of our life. Some live life with gusto, squeezing out of life every bit of fun and enjoyment they can. All right? That's some of you in here, and you're just, enjoy life. That first thing just resonates with me. Yes! Let's go do that! You're probably going to need to be reminded regularly, but fear God. And then some of us in here will be more on the fear God side, the stoic, a little more cautious, a little more sober, everything's serious in life, and just, be really careful with all that stuff. And you're going to need this reminder regularly. You know what? Enjoy life. It's God's gift. It's this balancing walk. Wisdom is not this cut and dry, everything's black and white, there it is, there's the whole answer. You watch this be worked out in our lives. Even these lists could go on and on. All I've done is give you runway that you can fly your plane off of and go and look at your whole life yourself. Survey your life and see how you can enjoy life and fear God. The peak purpose of this futile life is not found in the gain one gets, but in the God who gives. Our existence, the events appointed, the eternity awaiting, is intended to keep us falling until we fall before the one who gave it to us. In a word, the third leg that gives stability, or what we find at the top of this highest peak, in one word, is a relationship. And let me just ask this morning, do you have a relationship with this God who gives? Do you have a relationship with the God who made you and appointed for you tasks appropriate to your life? Do you have a relationship with the eternal God who inhabits eternity and who put eternity within your heart? See, the problem of life, don't miss this, the problem of life is not so much the stuff outside of us, it's the sin inside of us. In that look around back at the beginning, here's how we're wired. Blame it all on the events, the stuff. The problem is inside. Sin separates us from God. Sin births us into this world in rebellion against God, not in relationship with God. And this is what makes the gospel of Jesus Christ so wonderful, such good news. The good news about Jesus is that he entered this life not in rebellion, but in relationship with the Father. The eternal Son of God died on the cross to pay the sinner's infinite debt. And because he rose again from the dead, he's able to give sinners new life to live in peaceful relationship with God. Romans 5:1 says it this way, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. The good news of Jesus Christ is that unrighteous sinners can be righteous before God through faith in Christ. And that righteousness grants peace with God, rebellion forgiven, relationship restored. And now I can walk through this world with the things God has given, the events he's given, and the eternity he's placed in my heart. And now I have a relationship with the one who gave it all. Throughout the rest of this book, here's what Solomon's going to do. He's going to bring us down off this peak in the passages to come. And more or less, if I can describe Ecclesiastes this way, the rest of Ecclesiastes is taking these two ideas of enjoy life and fear God and basically working with these two pieces and trying to wisely look at life and maneuver and look at how this works. But what's going to happen is throughout the book, he's going to bring us back to these peaks. You can almost map these sections out in Ecclesiastes where he comes back to this idea, don't forget, God's the creator. Don't forget, God's the judge. Don't forget, God's in control. And he's going to keep bringing us back up to get our bearings again. Oh yeah, that's right. It's about the giver. Now let's go back down and let's figure out enjoy life and fear God, and let's keep working with this. And if we keep that in mind, it's going to help us a lot when we get to some passages that initially you read and you go, what in the world? Well, Solomon's down in the weeds and the messiness of life with us, and he's trying to take these two realities. God's given these things, so enjoy and fear and work it out. But this morning, we look at this passage and we find the purpose of this futile life is found in a personal relationship with the God who gives. So, look up. Let's pray.